How does Stephen King feel about how much he inspired Stranger Things? Which character shares a name with the scriptwriter of a classic sci-fi horror film? And what's the shared connection between Stranger Things, Terminator, 11, and Luke Skywalker? We've got a lot to get through, so let's get right into this with one of the biggest influences, without whom there'd be no Stranger Things. Stephen King's influence. I mean, just look at the show's intro. Remind you of anything? It certainly should. The show's logo was deeply inspired by the aesthetic behind Stephen King's book covers in the 1980s. And that's not the only thing. The ongoing story behind Stranger Things was also clearly influenced by the works of the horror master. For example, what if I told you about this great story where a nerdy boy gang and a girl have to fight a horrible creature from another dimension? What's the first thing that springs to mind? Stephen King's It? Or Netflix's Stranger Things? Yeah, even the Duffer brothers, creators of Stranger Things, admitted how paramount Pennywise's story was for them.
So without it, there really would be no Stranger Things, probably.
And what if I were to ask you about the story of a mysterious outsider, an eerily quiet girl with telekinetic superpowers? How about we throw in an evil government organization that abuses their power and are involved in dangerous experiments? We could be talking about any number of Stephen King's bestsellers: Carrie, The Dead Zone, Quitters Inc., to name just a few. And how about the kinda canine demogorgons in season 2? Remind you of another seminal work from Stephen King? Couldn't possibly be Cujo, could it? Bingo! In the words of Hopper himself, I love that book. That's a nasty mutt. In season 1, there was even a guard in Hawkins' lab reading a book with a pretty familiar face on it. The showrunners evidently couldn't help including a nod and a wink to the audience. Another fun reference can be found in season 1, episode 4, more specifically in the name of the episode itself. Yes, it was called The Body, which was inspired, of course, by Stephen King's novella of the same name, which sometime later became something of a coming-of-age classic. See the cinematography side by side. As the Duffers themselves say, a very direct homage to Stand By Me. Stranger Things feels so much like a horror novel written by King that it sent plenty of people down a Google rabbit hole trying to find out if the series was based on an actual work by Stephen King. Even the horror master himself couldn't help but comment on the fact that Stranger Things clearly owed a lot to his early works. But to be fair, it wasn't just Stephen King who provided a major influence on how the show would turn out. Or maybe it's more accurate to say he wasn't the only Stephen. Any ideas about who that second Stephen might be? Well, before we reveal all, let's return to the show's intro and listen to that amazing theme music one more time. You might be wondering where this cool, retro, synthwave intro music came from. It's definitely got more than a flavor of John Carpenter to it, one of the greatest cult horror movie directors and also composers of the 1980s. Music inspiration. If you ever see a film by John Carpenter, especially the ones he composed the soundtrack for, then you won't ever be able to forget it. The same goes for the Duffer brothers. Drawing inspiration from the horror maestro, the pair wanted to create a musical theme for Stranger Things that recalled Carpenter's work in films like Halloween, The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing. And that's exactly what they achieved. And yeah, electronic expert Ennio Morricone added his own immediately recognizable contribution to The Thing, but Carpenter's involvement was key. More than that, the Duffer brothers even featured a few of Carpenter's own themes in the series. Check out this scene from season 2, episode 7, when 11 meets the other subjects in Chicago, which features a short snippet of the score from Escape from New York. The show's creators unapologetically admit that they tried to make their intro music sound a lot like the themes from The Fog, Halloween, and naturally The Thing. And you have to admit, they have a lot in common. And we couldn't talk about musical inspirations without mentioning the most obvious music reference in the series so far. Dusty Bun and Susie Poo singing that song from The Never-Ending Story. Classic. Alien and Aliens. Let's start at the very beginning with an obvious reference. And not so obvious one. There's also a scene where a state trooper claims to have found Will's body. We now know that he was wrong, but relevant to us right now is the trooper's name, David O'Bannon. This subtle detail is in fact a reference to Dan O'Bannon, the guy who wrote the original script to Alien and also co-wrote Carpenter's debut film, Dark Star. So yeah, not all that obvious. The appearance of the Upside Down, the animatronic version of the Demogorgon, the tendril pinned to Will's mouth, and all that goo. Everything connected to the monsters of Stranger Things has to be a huge reference to Alien and the Alien franchise as a whole. And it isn't always terribly subtle. How about that egg Hopper finds in the Upside Down? After Alien, Aliens, Prometheus, and the rest, it's safe to say that almost anyone outside the show would instinctively know to avoid that by now. The show's creators were even so brazen as to put together a poster that's a clear homage to the 1979 film that started it all. In the Upside Down, no one can hear you scream. In space, no one would hear you scream. That's really skirting that thin line between homage and pastiche. And talking of posters, I can't just pass them by and not talk about some other references to classic 80s movie billboards. Poster homages. A Nightmare on Elm Street, Jaws, Stand By Me, The Running Man, The Evil Dead, and Firestarter. All these classic horror movies received an honorary homage through posters to the second season of Stranger Things. In addition to these direct off-screen references, there are also some really cool on-screen Easter eggs in the series itself. Did you notice the name of the movies being screened at the cinema in the third season? Back to the Future, Cocoon, The Stuff, Return to Oz, Daryl and Fletch? I'm sure that Back to the Future doesn't need any further explanation, but what about all the other movies? All of them were direct inspirations to Stranger Things to some degree or another. Like, for example, the movie Daryl and Fletch tells the story of a government experiment to create a dangerous child lookalike soldier for military purposes. Not that dissimilar from Eleven's situation, is it? And Ron Howard's Cocoon is all about aliens sleeping deep underwater in, yeah, cocoons, waiting for other aliens to come back for them. And The Stuff is about a mysterious and addictive food sludge that makes everyone who eats it a ghoulish, zombie-like creature before actually eating them. The spirit of the 80s lives on. Let's return to the posters for a minute. We spotted a cool poster for the movie Firestarter at the family video store. In case you hadn't guessed, Firestarter was one of the most important and biggest influences behind the character of Eleven, especially with her disguised appearance in season 1. There's no way that's a coincidence. If you didn't know, Firestarter is a movie adaptation of, yes, Stephen King's book of the same name. I told you the Duffer brothers adore Stephen King. And here are some other memorable poster references from Stranger Things. This Evil Dead poster in Jonathan's room. John Carpenter's The Thing poster in the basement. Speaking of which, not only did the characters have a poster of the movie, but some of them even ended up watching it on their TV. You could even say that this is a super sneaky reference to John Carpenter's Halloween, where the protagonist Laurie watches The Thing from Another World. And the crazy thing? That was from 1978. 4 years before Carpenter would go on to direct his adaptation. The Duffers couldn't help but use this metatextual trick again, usually using Eleven as a vehicle for their references. Elle watches Frankenstein in season 2, episode 2 for a very specific reason. She feels lonely, isolated in that particular moment. Like a monster, a mere medical experiment, just like Frankenstein's monster. Pretty on the nose, but it gets the job done. As you can see, there are loads of small, direct references in Stranger Things, so before we get to one of the biggest influences, let's have a quick fire round. Buckle up, they're gonna come at you thick and fast. The 80s cocktail. Mad Max. Naming the character Max and the way she drives that car is for sure an homage to John Miller's action series Mad Max. No surprise, as this is one of the Duffer brothers' favourite movies. The Goonies, a kids on a mission adventure movie starring Sean Astin that gave the showrunners a great atmospheric push in terms of inspiration. Just look at this cinematography. The Duffer brothers evidently loved it and were all too happy to lift it when it came to their own series. Not a coincidence that Sean Astin ended up in Stranger Things himself, eh? Ghostbusters! Oh, come on! This one's not even subtle. You have to remember the gang all dressed up as Ghostbusters for Halloween, right? Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back. Yoda and the Force are a big influence to Eleven's character development. Like when she tries to move that train car, it's 100% like Luke trying to lift his X-Wing. And how about her diminutive size? Very, Yoda-esque. Size not important after all. And what about that stony Russian assassin from season 3? A tireless, seemingly unkillable, emotionless, robotic killer with a vaguely Eastern European accent. Gotta be Schwarzenegger from the Terminator. Will's possession by the Mind Flayer from the Upside Down might be scientific in nature, but the reference to The Exorcist is downright demonic. Winona Ryder breaking through a wall with an axe? The Shining? The monster hands coming out of the wall? Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street. We could be here for hours naming all the references, but now it's time to take a look at another storyteller who left his own massive mark on Stranger Things. The other Steven. Steven Spielberg's influence. Spielberg is such an incredible storyteller that it's almost impossible to not love his movies. Now, you ever feel like those movies are a bit, I don't know, cliched or formulaic? Well, just remember one thing. Spielberg invented the formula. He's responsible for shaping the classical understanding of much of our modern visual storytelling. Like many people, directors included, the Duffer brothers grew up on Spielberg's vision, and it naturally became part of the fabric of their TV series, along with a healthy dose of respect and some bittersweet nostalgia. How about this classic example in the development of Eleven's character that parallels that of E.T.? Just look at these shots. Eleven was found in a field late at night. The boys hide her from everyone in order to protect her, her naive yet kind personality concealing an extremely powerful and even dangerous ability. And we couldn't just skip over that classic van scene. Both the gangs from Stranger Things and E.T. wouldn't have escaped from the government if it weren't for Eleven and/or E.T. and their paranormal powers. If Stephen King inspired the story and the spirits of the show, then Steven Spielberg inspired the characters, cinematography, and suspense. Stranger Things owes that unique imaginary feeling to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and no small amount of its suspense to Jurassic Park, especially if we're talking about that kitchen scene with the velociraptors. The Duffer brothers even gave Hopper the same car from Jaws. Sure, there's some superficial cosmetic modifications, but still, you can tell it's pretty much the same car. And it turns out that the way the Duffers approached some of the special effects scenes was deeply influenced by Indiana Jones. We could talk for decades about the inspiration to the Duffer brothers' Stranger Things, but like all good things, this video must come to an end. What do you folks think? Where do you draw the line between homage and pastiche? When does meta become meh? And did you find any other unexpected references in Stranger Things that link to other Hollywood classics? Tell us in the comments. Speaking of cliches, if you like this video, then like and subscribe and hit the bell and yada 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 yada. But as always, stay awesome.